He's the original Sadiq. He's the father of our religion. Isn't there a different standard? How can you apply California law in 2022 to the conduct of a man who performed this act many, many millennia ago?
Thank you, Your Honor. The simple answer to the question is within the question, and it's because God tells us to. God tells us that we should have this dichotomy with it. As I mentioned, the tzedek, the repetition of the word twice. But there's another concept that God teaches us, that there's two different types of commandments that he makes within the Torah. There's the ones known as ben adam lamakom, and the other ones that are known as ben adam lachavara, the distinction being the commandments between man and God. And there's a whole nother set of commandments between man and man. And that's what we're here today to judge. The commandments between man and man, you can have disparate outcomes with the law that God applies and the morals that he's teaching, and the ones that we set up between ourselves. Because God tells us in Shoftim, in the portion we just read this past Saturday, set up your courts, set up your judges, don't take bribes, make sure it's an honest court. These things are set up for us because God wants us to sit amongst ourselves and judge. What happens when we die, what God judges, what God decides, that's in his realm. But in this court, Your Honor, you are Your Honor, and they are the triers of fact. God is not sitting in the jury box. Other men, women, peers, Abraham's own descendants sit in judgment, because that's the way it should be. It's not a question of, as Professor Dershowitz said, whether or not you question your faith. I'm sure it is true what he said. Every rabbi, from the most holy there is to regardless of denomination, I'm sure has had a moment in time where they've questioned faith. It's not whether or not you question your faith. It's what you do when you have that question. Here, Abraham demonstrates clearly through his actions and through his shame afterwards that his faith told him he must do what God said. And I want to address what Professor Dershowitz said about Sodom, because it's a very different set of facts. In the story of Sodom, Abraham hears that God intends to lay waste to Sodom. There's no test for Abraham there. God doesn't tell Abraham, I want you to go to Sodom and wipe them out. There's no commandment, there's no instruction, there's no test of faith. So Abraham chimes in and says, wait a second, maybe we can do something here. Maybe we can negotiate this down. If I find 100 righteous men, 10 righteous men. And he negotiates with God. But he doesn't do that here. He makes no attempt, there's no indication at any time that he questions the instructions here. Professor Dershowitz mentioned Moses' advocacy. It's the same thing. Moses isn't instructed to punish the people. God tells Moses he's going to do it, and Moses advocates. It's a separation of the areas of law and a different determination of faith. And for what we're here to decide, his faith violated man's law.
Well, just a quick follow-up question, then I'll have one last question for Professor Dershowitz. So you said in your opening statement that Abraham said to, let me get your direct quote here. You said that when Abraham said to Isaac, God will provide the lamb, you said that Abraham was lying. However, if Abraham knew that God would provide an animal for sacrifice, isn't that evidence that he had no intent to kill Isaac? Isn't that exactly what Professor Dershowitz is saying?
No, because when Abraham, first of all, Abraham is not prophetic in that manner, because first of all, Abraham says to Isaac, God will provide a lamb. And in fact, when there is an animal, it happens to be a ram, not a lamb. There's a different animal. So it's not like he has this prophecy and he knows exactly what's going to happen. But beyond that, there's the question of whether or not when Abraham gets to the top of the mountain with Isaac, it goes through the progression of what he does. He builds the altar, he puts the wood on the altar, he binds Isaac, he puts Isaac on the altar. You know what's missing from that progression? He looks for a ram. He looks for a lamb. He looks for some other sacrifice. He didn't need to look for another sacrifice. He had brought it with him. He was intending to kill Isaac. Had he been looking for another animal, he would have done so. But this was a test of Abraham's faith. And frankly, to question that faith is to question why Abraham, as somebody mentioned earlier, his name was Avram. He changed it to Avraham, adding the H for the symbolism of God. God is fundamental to who Abraham is and in his following. And merely because he's following the actions of God does not get him off the hook for what God told him to do. He's still responsible for his own actions. And there's no indication anywhere other than from very clever argument by counsel that in fact was the intent, that he knew there was going to be another animal there. He also tells the servants and Isaac that we're going to go there, we're going to pray. He actually doesn't say that we're going to do the sacrifice. They actually say we'll worship and then we'll return. Well, they didn't worship and he didn't return with Isaac. So the statements that he even made to the servants are also not true.
All right. Well, I think that one is very brave to call Abraham a liar, and so I commend you for that. Professor, here's the last question I'll ask tonight. There's been a lot of discussion about faith and faithfulness, and it's unquestionable, regardless of whose perspective you're looking at, that this was a test that God was giving to Abraham. And he passed because he was faithful. How can we not condemn Abraham when, if there is somebody else who steadfastly believes in their religion and believes that God is talking to them when they strap a bomb to their chest and explode themselves with a lot of other people in a crowded bus? Isn't that also an act of faithfulness? How can we judge that any differently?
That's a great question. And we do and should condemn people who kill others on the basis of faith. The question is not whether we are going to condemn or praise Abraham. Abraham can be praised for a lot of things. The question is whether he's guilty of attempted murder. And he could still be unpraiseworthy. And I think I said that. I conceded it in my opening argument. He was unpraiseworthy for causing psychological damage, maybe for lying. But if I were a lawyer, I'd object to introducing other crimes evidence, lies, and other character deficiencies on the part of Abraham. But the one thing he couldn't bring himself to do in the end, and he wouldn't bring himself to do in the end, was to kill. So Abraham expressed great, great faith, but the faith was empirical faith. And that may be the strongest faith there is. I have so much faith in God. I have so much faith that he is Tzedek, that he is Kodesh. I have so much faith in the goodness and the greatness of God that I know he could never, ever ask me to go through with this act. He's testing me. He's testing me. And I am prepared to accept the test up to a certain point. Yeah, I will lie to my servants. Yeah, I will impose psychological trauma. Yeah, I will say lamb when it's really a ram. I will do those things. But ultimately, I do not believe God would ever test me based on my willingness to kill my son, my only son, the one that I love, particularly because at the time of Abraham's actions, there was no olam haba. There was no notion that there was a world to come, that he would be reunited with Isaac at some point. This was the end. This was the termination of a human life. It would have been the most selfish act in the world. After all, he did have not only a child before, but 5 children afterward. For Sarah, it was her only child, her beloved child, and Sarah suffered greatly after learning that Abraham came even close to doing that without seeking her consent to test God by going up to the mountain. So I think we have a lot of commonality here. Nobody is praising people for causing damage based on faith, based on moral faith. But in the end, it's the empirical faith that matters. And the empirical faith is what kept Abraham. Now, there are those in the Bible who have interpreted, commentators, who have interpreted the angel. After all, God didn't come down and tell him not to do it. God had told him to offer. He didn't tell him to withdraw the offer. He sent only a messenger to do it. And the question is, was it really a messenger? Or was it Abraham's conscience? Was it his unwillingness to carry through the act? Was it the angel in him? As Madison put it, the better angels of humankind. He wasn't referring to some external ghost. He was referring to something that human beings have the capacity to do, and that is to have conflicting obligations, moral faith obligations, empirical faith obligations, and ultimately to resolve them by their better angels. And that's what Abraham did.
Thank you very much. All right, ladies and gentlemen,